Dr. Greg here again, and we're back to sugar. What I want everyone to understand is that these videos, I'm going to try and keep them around 9 minutes or so because there's a lot of information to unpack about sugar's effect on the body. So today I'm just going to touch upon a little bit about what is sugar and that it's a carbohydrate, how our body utilizes carbohydrate and glucose and sugar and stuff like that. So when you're looking at foods that are packaged, processed foods, there are about 50 plus words for sugar. So when you look at a product listing of ingredients, by law, it's supposed to have the most abundant ingredient first, and then it goes down from there. So if you see something like dextrose, which is another name for sugar, and then you look down and 5 words later it says sugar, you know that probably sugar is the most abundant product in that processed food. So you have to be aware of this kind of stuff. Now I'm going to do a video on products, and you're going to be very interested to find out how much sugar is in all these kind of foods. But at any rate, I wanted you to understand why simple carbohydrates like sugar and bread, it's a simple carbohydrate, a simple chain of carbs that is easy for it to break down. What happens is it's broken down quickly in your system. So there's a spike of carbohydrates in your blood that requires it to be processed by your body. And it's processed in a way where you create insulin, which is a hormone which is created in the pancreas, and that actually mobilizes the sugar and puts it in places. Now, when you have excess sugar, it puts in places that tend to be fat cells. And it's a different kind of fat cell. There are fat cells that are brown fat, and there are fat cells that are white fat. The brown fat is better for you than the white fat, and the white fat is where mostly sugar goes. So what happens when your pancreas is constantly asked to produce this hormone called insulin, and it's produced in a group of cells in your pancreas called the islet of Langerhans. Now, when they produce this insulin over and over and over again, because you're constantly consuming these sugars, and the reason you are, and this is very interesting, is the brain doesn't realize you're doing that. I mean, it's kind of weird, but you eat a cookie, a lot of sugar is in the cookie, your brain doesn't know really that there's a lot of sugar there because it's kind of fooled and it wants to consume more because it's not satiated. Okay? Proteins and fats satiate your brain. Sugar does not, so you need to eat more because it says, I haven't eaten. Kind of weird. And that excess sugar needs to be processed because your body doesn't want to have a lot of sugar in your blood. Now, I'm just going to say some numbers. So your fasting means you haven't eaten sugar, blood sugar level. Glucose should be around 80 to 90 at the very most. What happens when you have excess sugar? It can be higher than 90. It could be 100, 120. That means that your pancreas has to pump out more insulin. Now, over time, what happens is that your body begins to say, hey, all this insulin, too much. I don't care about it anymore. And it's called insulin resistance. In other words, your insulin cannot process the sugar anymore, and the sugar starts in your blood starts going up, up, and up, and starts having other effects, which we're going to talk about. And then what happens is you're considered a type 2 diabetic. A type 2 diabetic is someone that acquires diabetes over time. Now, type 2 diabetes is a significant disability and is on the rise in the country because we're eating way too much sugar. So that's what happens when you have simple carbohydrates, which is sugar, becomes excessive because your brain thinks, I'm not eating, you're not eating anything, and more insulin reacts to it because the sugar level in your blood goes up. It has to keep it at a certain level to be healthy, and then all of a sudden, your cells begin to say, we don't want that insulin anymore, and it becomes insulin resistance. In other words, insulin can't take care of the sugar anymore, and it keeps going up, which has its own consequences, which we're going to talk in another video. So that's why simple carbs or sugar is really not good for you. Okay? Now, let's talk about how sugar affects your brain. Now, we talked about the fact that your brain doesn't realize you're eating when you just have sugar, and it needs more and more. And this is kind of a form of addiction because it's a hollow calorie. There's no benefit for your body to eat carbohydrates, and I'm going to explain why in a few minutes. There's absolutely zero benefits. So what does that mean? Well, we really don't need fruit to survive. We don't need a lot of vegetables to survive. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but there are vegetables, especially vegetables that grow underground, that have high amounts of sugar. Remember in one of the videos I was talking about beet sugar. There are beet sugar factories in the United States that makes beet sugar because sugar is found in these kind of vegetables. So when you're having carrots, you think, oh, I'm being very healthy, I'm going to go have a cookie. You're actually doubling your sugar intake. Now, that's not to say that these vegetables have great minerals and vitamins in it. I'm just saying that they do have a lot of sugar in it, and we need to think about that. Now, its effect on the brain is that the more sugar we have, the fact is that your brain doesn't realize you're eating a lot of sugar, and it becomes tolerant to even more sugar. And we want more and more to the point where we are addicted, and an addiction takes up brain energy. So have you ever had a big meal and you wanted to have a sweet afterwards because you feel like, I didn't eat anything, but your stomach is full. So you have that sweet. Your brain still thinks you didn't eat anything, and you have some more sweets because the big meal you had didn't have enough fats in it, didn't have enough protein in it, which I'm going to explain why that's important. And your brain thinks, oh, I didn't have enough. So you go for the sugar, constantly going for it. That's where obesity comes in. That's where overeating comes in. That's where a lot of problems come in. Arguably, that digestion and bowel movements and all that kind of stuff is affected by our excessive eating because our brain is thinking we're not eating the right kinds of foods, or we're not eating, basically. It's just making a decision. Oh, you didn't eat. Let's go eat. And you go for the sugar because you're addicted to it. So let's talk about the pancreas. Now, the pancreas is what produces the insulin, and what you're doing is you're really making that pancreas work overtime, and it wears out. Bad things can happen to that, and I'm going to talk about that in later videos. But when you're type 2 diabetic, the pancreas is not making enough insulin, and you have to take insulin. That changes your life forever. Insulin is a hormone, and it's damaging to your nervous system. It's also damaging to your brain. That's all I have to say about that. And it's also linked with another hormone called cortisol. Cortisol levels go up when insulin levels go up. Why does insulin cause cortisol levels to go up? Because when you're in a stressful situation, your body has to mobilize its energy because your muscles need energy. And what happens is that the insulin is released and the glucose is released into your bloodstream so you can do emergency things. And cortisol goes up to sort of help mobilize that. That's why eating a lot of sugar produces a lot of insulin, which could also lead to other things which we're going to talk about later. But you see how all this is piecing together. Now, what is about carbohydrates that is really unnecessary for it to eat? So our body is mainly made up of proteins and fat. That's what makes up our body. Our brain, in actuality, is 60% fat. That's a lot of fat. Now, we do make carbohydrates, and it's called the Krebs cycle. And we make ATP, which is the body's energy currency. And it needs glucose to make ATP, and I agree with that. But you don't need simple sugars to produce that glucose. What happens is that really efficient Krebs cycle can make fats into carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates are utilized by your body for what it needs, not for what you think it needs. So just like too much medication or too overeating, your body can only use so much, and it knows exactly how much it needs. If you let your body do that, you're going to be fine. So fats and proteins will really satiate your desire for sugar. It is very difficult to get off of sugar. Matter of fact, it's more difficult probably than cocaine. So What you have to do is, if you're really addicted to sugar, you can go cold turkey, and that's a big challenge. In other words, don't have any sugar whatsoever. Sometimes what I recommend is make one part of the day a look forward to. So in other words, I usually try to pick the early part of the day, like for breakfast or lunch, no later. Sugar at night is one of the worst things you can possibly do. So let's say, for instance, I'm going to have a really good breakfast, eggs, bacon, whatever, and I'm going to have a muffin. Well, that muffin has sugar in it, right? And I'm going to wait for that muffin. I'm not going to have any sugar for the rest of the day, and I'm going to wait for that muffin. It could also be lunch. After lunch, I'm going to have a piece of candy or a candy bar, but that's all I'm going to have. So by having a look forward to, you sort of trick your brain or help your brain say, okay, I'm going to hang out until that candy bar. Over time, you may find that you don't need that candy bar anymore. Things get a little bit easier to resist that sugar. So that's all I have today. We're going to get really deeper into this stuff in the next few videos, but I wish you well. And I want you to understand, I do this because I want you to be as healthy as possible, and I want you to take ownership of your health. It's very important that we all do our part to keep ourselves as healthy as possible. So we don't need pills, we don't need intervention. All we need is to do good things for our body, and our body will do good things for us. This is Dr. Greg, changing the way we look at health.